They were the key to breaking a 4-year nightmare, an elite force that could shatter the strongest defenses and march for miles behind enemy lines. They were Germany's super soldiers, the pioneers of a new way of war. But what if the very thing that made them unstoppable was also the seed of their own destruction? This is the tragic story of how the German stormtroopers, in their greatest triumphs, became victims of their own success. By 1915, the First World War had ground to a horrifying halt. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, millions of men were trapped in a labyrinth of mud, steel, and death. This was trench warfare, a new kind of industrial slaughter that no one had prepared for. The old way of war, the massed infantry charge, was now just a recipe for suicide. Standard attacks meant sending enormous waves of riflemen in broad lines, a method that collapsed catastrophically under the defensive firepower of machine guns and modern artillery. A single, well-placed machine gun could mow down an entire line of advancing men in seconds. Endless belts of barbed wire ensnared soldiers in the open, turning them into helpless targets. The high commands on all sides seemed to have no answer. Their only solution was to throw more men into the meat grinder, hoping that sheer numbers could overwhelm the enemy. This only led to casualty lists of an incomprehensible scale. Offensives that cost hundreds of thousands of lives might gain only a few hundred yards of shattered earth, territory that was often lost in a counterattack the very next day. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers lived in a constant state of filth and fear, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The German High Command, facing a war of attrition on two fronts, knew this was a fight they couldn't win. They were trapped in a bloody stalemate, and they desperately needed a new idea, a new weapon, and a new kind of soldier to break the deadlock before Germany itself bled to death. The solution didn't come from the top down, it came from the bottom up. On the front lines, German officers and NCOs, seeing the futility of mass assaults, had been experimenting with new tactics from the start. Early trials came from combat engineers who were already experienced with siege warfare. As early as 1915, experimental detachments were formed, using weapons perfect for the claustrophobic horror of the trenches: flamethrowers, mortars, and heaps of hand grenades. Inspiration also came from the enemy. On the Eastern Front, the Germans watched in shock as the Russians' Brusilov offensive used sudden, massive, and highly accurate artillery strikes, followed immediately by concentrated attacks from shock troops to shatter the defenses of their Austro-Hungarian allies. These concepts were quickly adapted and refined. But the true breakthrough came from one man, Captain Willy Rohr. A veteran combat engineer, Rohr was given command of a battered experimental unit in August 1915. He immediately saw that impractical ideas like heavy body armor were a death sentence. He realized that speed was far better protection than steel. Working with other forward-thinking officers, Rohr began to centralize these new ideas. He saw the core problems: not enough specialized weapons training and zero cooperation between units. He envisioned a new type of soldier, quick, mobile, and flexible, trained to exploit chaos rather than stick to a rigid plan. His experimental unit, which would eventually become the famous Assault Battalion Rohr, became a laboratory where, through relentless trial and error, the modern stormtrooper was forged. Under Captain Rohr's leadership, what started as informal trench raiding parties evolved into a formal doctrine. His unit, Assault Battalion Rohr, became a school for the entire German army. Select officers and NCOs from across the Western Front were sent to train with Rohr. They learned his revolutionary methods before returning to their own divisions to create new assault battalions. The model was so successful that by the end of 1916, the creation of these specialized shock troops was being integrated across the Army. The training was unlike anything else. It was intense, practical, and it wasn't just about how to fight, but how to think. Soldiers learned to spot enemy weak points, how to launch sudden attacks, and most importantly, how to read the battlefield and adapt on the fly. This wasn't just drilling, it was a psychological reconditioning. The men selected for these units had to be the best. They were often young, unmarried, and both physically and mentally tough, with a high degree of aggression and initiative. They volunteered for this, trading the relative safety of a regular trench for the high-intensity life of an elite soldier. A powerful esprit de corps developed, cementing them as the vanguard. Their new steel helmet, the Stahlhelm, which offered far better protection than the old spiked Pickelhaube, became a symbol of this elite status. They weren't trained to be cogs in a machine, they were trained to be predators. The stormtroopers' edge came from a radical shift in weaponry. They ditched the reliance on the long-range rifle for a suite of tools designed for brutal, close-quarters combat. They traveled light to stay fast, but they were armed to the teeth. The weapon of choice? The hand grenade. A stormtrooper might charge into battle with grenades stuck in his belt and one in each hand, his rifle slung over his back. For reinforced positions, they used cluster charges, 7 grenade heads strapped to a single stick, a bundle powerful enough to demolish a machine gun nest. Their entire arsenal was built for trench clearing. The long, clumsy infantry rifle was often replaced with a shorter carbine. Pistols, trench knives, clubs, and sharpened spades became standard issue. The Germans had learned that distant artillery couldn't always destroy entrenched machine guns, so they brought the artillery to the soldier. Light mortars and specially designed 3.7-centimeter Sturmkanone could be moved across the battlefield for direct close-range fire. Flamethrowers became an integral and terrifying part of their toolkit, used to clear dugouts and sow panic. Later in the war, stormtroopers would be the first to get a truly revolutionary weapon, the submachine gun. The Bergmann MP-18, essentially a handheld machine gun firing pistol rounds, was the perfect weapon for their tactics, providing immense portable firepower. This focus on overwhelming close-range violence made every stormtrooper a walking arsenal. The true genius of the stormtroopers wasn't just their weapons, but how they used them. Their doctrine, known as infiltration tactics, was a complete break from the clumsy wave attacks that had defined the war. Instead of crashing against the trenches like a massive wave, stormtroopers were taught to poke holes and flow through the enemy's defenses like water. The key was always to avoid a head-on fight with the enemy's strongest points. Here's how an assault worked. It began with a short, violent artillery bombardment, often mixing high explosives with poison gas. The goal wasn't to obliterate the front line, but to neutralize and disorient the defenders. Then, under the cover of a creeping barrage, a moving wall of shell fire, the stormtroopers advanced in small, dispersed groups, using craters and any cover they could find.
And this is where the tactical revolution happened. They were ordered to bypass enemy strongpoints. Instead of getting bogged down fighting a well-defended machine gun nest, they would slip past it, leaving it for the next wave. Their main mission was to push deep into the enemy's rear, destroying headquarters, cutting communication lines, and capturing artillery. This paralyzed the enemy's ability to coordinate a defense. Heavier infantry would follow to attack the strong points that had been bypassed and isolated, and regular infantry would then mop up any remaining resistance. This doctrine relied on decentralized command. Junior leaders had the freedom to make split-second decisions, seizing opportunities without waiting for orders from miles away. It made them a thinking, adaptable weapon on a static battlefield. The new tactics were first tested on a large scale during the Inferno of Verdun in 1916. Assault Battalion Rohr was in the first wave, leading units into French trenches just seconds after the artillery barrage lifted, proving the concept in one of the most brutal battles in human history. But the stormtroopers' most stunning performance would come on the Italian front. The Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 was a masterpiece of infiltration. Austro-Hungarian forces, reinforced by elite German units, including a young captain named Erwin Rommel, launched a surprise attack. It began with a short, intense artillery strike, using gas and smoke to blind the defenders. Then, as the last shells fell, the stormtroopers did what they did best. They slipped through the fog at weak points in the Italian lines, bypassing strong positions and pushing deep into the rear. The effect was catastrophic. The entire Italian front was torn open in hours. An observer noted they didn't come in waves, but in knots, slipping through the wire and striking from behind. The Italian defense simply collapsed. Panic led to surrender on a massive scale. By the end of the battle, Italian losses were devastating, with some estimates placing captures as high as 275,000 soldiers. The word Caporetto entered the Italian language as a synonym for a total disaster. For the Allies, it was a terrifying demonstration of the stormtroopers' power. For Germany, it was proof they now held the key to victory. March 21, 1918. With Russia out of the war, Germany moved nearly 1 million men to the Western Front for one last all-or-nothing gamble to win before the American armies could arrive in force. This was the Spring Offensive, codenamed Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle. It began with Operation Michael, the largest application of stormtrooper tactics in history. The attack was on a scale never seen before. Over 6,600 German guns and 3,500 trench mortars opened fire, unleashing 3.5 million shells in just 5 hours, one of the most concentrated bombardments in history. Then, under a thick blanket of fog and gas, and shielded by a perfectly timed creeping barrage, the stormtrooper units moved forward. They didn't attack in lines. They seemed to materialize out of the mist in small, scattered groups. They infiltrated the British lines at weak points, cutting telephone lines, isolating command posts, and creating chaos. Entire British battalions were surrounded before they even knew they were flanked. The British front, which had held for 4 years, was shattered in a single day. By that evening, over 21,000 British soldiers had been taken prisoner. The advance was breathtaking. In less than a week, German spearheads had pushed forward more than 60 kilometers, about 40 miles, the greatest territorial gain on the Western Front since 1914. The stormtroopers had achieved the impossible. They had broken the stalemate. It was their greatest triumph, a moment of seemingly unstoppable victory. But within this stunning success lay the seeds of a profound tragedy. The very thing that made the stormtroopers so effective, their role as the spearhead of every single attack, also guaranteed their destruction. During the Spring Offensive, these elite units were thrown into every crucial fight, serving as both the battering ram and the inspiration for the entire army. But this meant they consistently suffered the highest losses. In Operation Michael alone, the German army suffered nearly 240,000 casualties. The stormtrooper units, always at the very front, took the worst of it. Some battalions were almost completely wiped out. The original doctrine called for stormtroopers to have long periods of rest and training, but the desperation of 1918 made this impossible. They were kept advancing without relief, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The deeper they advanced, the more their supply lines broke down. Diaries and letters from German soldiers at the time tell a consistent story of starvation. Men were forced to live off captured British supplies, and discipline began to fray as exhausted troops looted enemy trenches for food and drink. The German army was squandering its most precious resource.
These weren't just soldiers, they were highly trained specialists, and they were irreplaceable. As Germany's manpower dwindled, a fallen stormtrooper was often replaced by a poorly trained recruit, if he was replaced at all. The cutting edge of the German military was being systematically ground down. By July 1918, the spring offensive had ground to a halt. The stormtroopers had created massive breakthroughs, but the regular German army was too exhausted and undersupplied to exploit them. The advance stalled from sheer exhaustion. The Germans had captured more ground than the Allies had in years, but they failed to seize their key strategic objectives, like the vital railway hub of Amiens. The tactical victories were strategically empty. The German army lacked the fresh reserves and motorized forces needed to turn a breakthrough into a decisive, war-winning victory. The elite stormtrooper divisions that had started the offensive were now just shadows of their former selves, filled with green replacements and racked by exhaustion and influenza. The very success of the stormtroopers had become a disaster. Because they were so good, they were thrown into every attack, and because they were always at the front, they were chewed up at an unsustainable rate. When the Allies, now massively reinforced by fresh American troops, launched their 100 Days offensive, they faced a German army whose spear had been broken. The exhausted German forces were driven into a retreat from which they would never recover. The stormtroopers had shown the world how to break the trenches, but at a cost so great that they became, quite literally, victims of their own success. This story is a powerful reminder that wars aren't just won with brilliant tactics, but with strategy, logistics, and human endurance. If you find these kinds of deep dives into military history compelling and want to see more content that explores the complex realities of warfare, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support makes these stories possible. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the war was over. The few stormtroopers who had survived returned to a defeated and broken Germany. They carried with them the memory of the horrors they had witnessed and the revolutionary tactics they had mastered. The term stormtrooper itself would be co-opted and forever tainted by the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, in the 1920s and 30s. But the military concept they pioneered did not vanish. The idea of small, highly aggressive, and autonomous assault teams infiltrating enemy defenses to cause chaos became a cornerstone of modern military doctrine. The principles of decentralized command, speed as armor, and shock action over firepower laid the foundation for future elite forces. We see the legacy of the Stoßtruppen today in the tactics of special operations units around the world. The German stormtroopers of World War I were a tragic paradox. They were a brilliant solution to the hell of the trenches, a force that changed the face of modern combat forever. But they were a finite resource, an elite cadre of men who were spent in a series of costly victories that ultimately sealed their nation's defeat. They were the Kaiser's super soldiers, an unstoppable force that in the end couldn't escape becoming the final victims of its own genius.